Hello and welcome to the Ditton Works YouTube channel. It's not very often I get messages from manufacturers, suppliers asking me to review something, but it's always nice when I do get an email or a message asking. And not so long ago I got an email from Fosi Audio asking me if I'd be interested in reviewing a couple of their products. Now I must admit I hadn't heard of the company, I wasn't familiar with them at all, but I agreed to. And sure enough, a few weeks later, the products arrived and I was really quite surprised. I did do a little bit of research just to get a bit of background on the company and the products they do. And initially I was a little disappointed because I found a review on the amplifier that I have that was terrible. And I thought, oh no, I don't want to have to review a product that's really, really bad. But after I did a little bit more research, I realised that the Fosi Audio TB10D has an upgraded version, a new version, an improved version, which is what this is. And this is what they've sent me. The other thing they've sent me is a BT30D Pro, which is another tiny little amplifier. But this one has the addition of Bluetooth. So let's have a chat about both these products. So first up, this one, the TB10D. Now if you look at the size of that, that is a tiny, tiny little digital amplifier. It features the Texas Instruments chip and it's rated, are you ready for this, at 600 watts, 300 watts per channel. However, when I did a little bit of investigation, that is dependent on what power supply you have. And with the one that came with it, I would say the output is probably significantly lower than that. So 32 volt, 5.0 amps. I would say we've probably halved that output, and that would be at 8 ohms. At 4 ohms, so at 8 ohms that would be half that. So I reckon the probable output of this tiny little amplifier is probably more realistically 75 watts. Now, I'm not really a massive fan of digital amplification. Years ago I had a Tact Millennium, which was an incredibly expensive piece of kit. It was beautifully built, but I found the characteristics of it very, very cold, very clinical. It had all the detail. It was wonderful in that regard, but it wasn't particularly musical. And then if you, in contrast, I went to valve amplifiers, which are way more musical, but potentially not as accurate or as clinical. And I wondered if this new generation of D-class amps was going to fall into the ultra clinical kind of department. And I'm used to my setup, which is an AB switching power amplifier. So it sits somewhere in the middle between valves and digital. Solid state has the power and the drive, which is a bonus over valves, but some lack musicality that you do get with valves. And it does come the age-old argument of musicality versus accuracy. It's a similar argument between CD and vinyl, valves, solid state, so on and so on. But digital, I've got to admit, I've not really been a fan. That is until I received this, which is under £100 for what, on the face of it, irrespective of power supply, is quite a powerful little amplifier. Now, what you are limited to is, you can see you've got your input for the power, your left and right input RCAs, and two, which will accept banana plugs, binding posts on the back. So you've only got one input. So how I tried this initially was using the internal DAC on my Blue Sound Node 2i and plug that straight into the back of this, and then plug this into the back of them, which is a pair of Celestion SL600s, which are a notoriously difficult loudspeaker to drive. You do need quite good amplification to get the most out of them. So using the streaming, I selected some of my favourite tracks and went about having a listen to this. And I've got to say, irrespective of the fact that this is sub £100, this really, really didn't sound bad at all. I think its ideal location would be a desktop setup or a bedroom setup or even a workshop setup, especially a place where you are limited for space, because this is tiny. It literally does fit in the palm of my hand. A couple of things that I didn't like, and they are minor things, is if we look at the tone controls, there is no indicators to give you plus or minus dB. And I presumed that the 12 o'clock position was naught. And I did set this at naught and then tried a different amplifier, a solid state amplifier, just to check that the treble and bass outputs were roughly the same. And I think I'm right, that 12 o'clock straight up is naught. If you wind it down, minus, plus is turning it up. And I set those at 12 o'clock position and proceeded to listen to this amplifier for quite some time. Even on speakers that are notoriously difficult to drive, this really didn't struggle. I will be fairly critical about this. If we're talking about audiophile grade pieces of equipment, then this is not it. This would be somebody who was quite happy with mid-fi, hi-fi kind of sound on a desktop setup on smaller speakers, limited space, and they would be more than happy with this because it did sound really good. If I'm hypercritical, in terms of soundstage presentation, it's not as good as my setup, but I'm running balanced XLRs and a pretty decent power amplifier, fairly new separate preamplifier. I've set it up as best I could, but this wasn't bad. And what I would say is if you were looking around on, say, the second-hand market for an older amplifier under £100, or if you were lucky enough to find, say, an Onkyo or a Denon or something on sale, you might find that around that sort of price point. But I would say this would easily be on par with that. And the only limiting feature is you've only got one input. So how I got round that, using the Blue Sound node, I could just do streaming. I then plugged in my Vincent phono amp, so I could try vinyl through it. And that was quite an interesting experiment. So I'm using analog front end running through a valve phono stage into a digital amp, and it sounded really quite good. The next way I tried it was using the Benchmark DAC as a function selector. So my Blue Sound node was then running into the DAC, and my TX CD transport was running into the DAC and then to this. So I could quickly switch between streaming and CD. And there was a detectable difference between those two formats. And I listened to CD for some time and thoroughly enjoyed this little thing. Now they're available on Amazon. Like I said, they're under £100. You're all probably going to think really cheap, nasty, but they're well built. It actually is. A metal case, lovely volume pots. There's no clicks or pops when you turned it on when it was plugged in. This must be a marked improvement over the one that received really poor reviews a few months ago. They've really done some work to this and made it really good. I was quite impressed. Now, if we move on to the other one, it's slightly larger, but it has got some more benefits to it. So we've got way more knobs on the front here. Still the same toggle switch for on-off, same power supply. What we've got here now is the addition of 3 banana inputs. So we're now able to run left and right and a subwoofer. So it would be a passive subwoofer. And you have the ability to dial that in, frequency response and volume, as well as tone controls and as well as volume controls. So you've got that same input there, but you've also got the addition of Bluetooth. Now this is a really ideal little piece of equipment, because if you've got very small satellite speakers that don't produce a lot of bass and you wanted some, you could always have a passive subwoofer under your desk or tucked away in the corner, or if it's in a bedroom setup, hidden out of the way, so you can keep it all nice and neat and tidy. The BT30D Pro is a very, very versatile piece of equipment. I tried the Bluetooth side of things, so it's an even easier setup. I could now literally just send things from my phone to this and I was getting music. I tend to think that the quality between the two, I would favour the more basic amplifier. And I think some of that is the fact that I'm transmitting things via Bluetooth and there's probably some degrading of the signal possibly, as where with this, the streaming, which is hardwired Ethernet cable straight into my router, and using the streamer direct to this amp was probably a little bit better. So if I was going to recommend one, I would probably go with the TB10D, just the little baby amplifier. But if you didn't want a streamer, separate device, and you wanted to literally send things from your phone or iPad, this little one here, which is the BT30D Pro, is a great little piece of equipment as well, with the addition of being able to run a subwoofer. So I was really quite pleasantly surprised. I've got to be honest that I wasn't expecting much out of these at all. I'm not a massive fan of digital amplification, as I said earlier, but these really surprised me. I don't want you to think that they're ultra high end. They're not. But my goodness, do you get a lot for your money. Both products are under £100. And these days, you don't get a lot for £100. Even on the second-hand market, you'd struggle to find something that was reliable, in spec and in good condition at that price. So I was pretty impressed, and I would definitely use one of these if I had a little workshop set up or a garage, or I was really restricted for space, because they are ideal. They absolutely do that job really, really well. And kudos to those. The SL600s are a difficult loudspeaker to run. They have quite tortuous impedance curves, but it dealt with it quite well. The only drawback, like I said, with both is their sound staging presentation isn't quite as good as some of the other amplifiers I've had. That my main setup does present a much better sound stage. It's deeper and wider, it's more musical, and it's got more scale. It will handle dynamics better. That is something of where this did struggle a little bit. But I would imagine anybody who needed something this small would be in a small room and probably wouldn't be playing it that loud. That was the only time this little thing struggled, was when it was at really elevated levels. That the swings in dynamics, this couldn't cope with quite as well as what my main setup does. Whether the upgraded power supply would affect that, that's unknown, but I would imagine it probably would, possibly. But thank you very much, Fosi Audio, for sending me these two wonderful pieces of equipment that I've thoroughly enjoyed listening to. They are really, really good. Kudos to you. Anyway, guys, that's the little Ditton Works review on the Fosi Audio TB10D and the BT30D Pro. Obviously, BT for Bluetooth. Fantastic. Take care, guys. I'll catch up with you soon.